So one of the things that I've always kind of had a bit of a difficulty understanding how we look at the world is, many of us presume that we are somehow different than other organisms or other things. And I'm very much on somebody that sort of generalizes what I understand to different areas. And I've read pretty broadly and understand different things, right, from psychology to engineering to sociology to um, lots of different things. And I've come to realize, like, you know, the generalities that we have are actually pretty remarkable around the world, and not even just around the world, but just in general, right? If you start looking at just basic principles as if you're a physicist or an ecologist, you're going to start to see these remarkable similarities between how we actually function um, compared to something else, right? If you start presuming that humans are somehow unique, right? Whatever that unique characteristic is, right? So maybe it is, um, standing on two legs. You're likely to find different organisms that do that. Birds, for example, might do that. There's, you know, um, some dogs are capable of walking on two legs, maybe not all the time, but you do start to see these patterns that are emerge. And when you start looking at this, and one of the things I think is interesting is that, if you look at within species, there's often more differences between within species than between species of different things, right? And we have to start to realize that the world is really messy. And I think, you know, the one reason why we sort of perceive that we're somehow better is that this is kind of the story that's been built into culturally in terms of how we understand the world, right? And it makes sense that we are going to be self-centered, right? In our worldview, even if it wasn't. So, the argument is that religion made us sort of think about that, but I don't think that's actually the case. I think it's much more deeper than that. I think we have very much, and we all do this, right? We have this sort of perspective of me first, because that makes sense for your organism, for what you're actually doing. If you were a cellular organism, you would want to be selfish with all the resources that you actually have too. It's economizing on resources, right? If you were a tree, for example, you're going to be as selfish as possible to take over a certain plot of land. Or if you start thinking about it in terms of an ecological point of view, you begin to realize, like, hey, we're really not different in how we sort of see the world, right? And that we're going to have a very self-centered, or I guess organism-centered world. Um, so if it's, this sort of deep, profound sense that we're unique, um, there's also something that I think has developed over time. Going back to the Greeks, um, where the Greek philosophers of, I think it was, I can't remember which one that started the idea of classifying things, but it's sort of based on this notion that things are different, right? And we'll have a better understanding. We sort of recognize the differences around the world in how we interact with the world, rather than coming from a perspective of, like, wait a minute, yes, there's all these unique differences, but are they, you know like, we have to come back to understanding that the world is actually really unique and really similar, based on the functions that we actually have, right? We need the sun. Everything that's living needs the sun. Everything that's living needs some water, right? Like, if you think about all these things, wow, we are really not that different from any other living organism that has the same sort of basic functions of biology. Um, and yes, there might be slight differences, right? But those differences are really not that big, of how we might function, right? Like, are we really that different from fungi, for example, and how we, how we sort of uh, organize, right? If you think of cellular structures, if you think of all of us as just these like clumps of cellular structures, fungi is just a clump of cells, and same as human beings, we're just a clump of cells that are responding to, water. We're responding to the environment just as if we're very similar in many different ways. Um, and I think that is a profound thought when you start looking at this. If we're not different from very distinct things, like I'm not that different from fungi, or I am not that different from um, I don't know what's some creature living in the sea, right? We're not that different in those sort of really distinct ways. Like, why do we even presume that we have that many differences between human beings? We're sort of nitpicking at these little tiny things that are essentially irrelevant, right? We sort of make these real big distinctions based on these very irrelevant characteristics that we might have, right? Like, people might have longer arms, and so they might, be able to compete better in sort of competitions with their longer arms. Um, People have slight differences in how quickly they can move, um, and then we recognize them. We honor somebody that's like world class runner, for example. And really, I mean, if you think about it, it's really pathetic in terms of how fast that they actually move compared to a cheetah, right? Um, all of these kind of things, we start looking at it and we start comparing more broadly rather than just within our sort of simple surrounding, or just, us as species, as human beings. We get to realize, like, wait a minute, these discussions are often really strange. Um, and we maybe need to start thinking a little more broadly in terms of how we view the world, because these little changes, these little subtle differences are so subtle in the grand scheme of things that they really don't make that much of a difference in terms of what we do and who we are. Um, and even if we're distinct from any other thing, I know that that is kind of a difficult thing for us to think about and to sort of comprehend and process. And it sort of stretches a lot of deep beliefs that we have. Um, but it's a very, very profound thought to think about how non-unique we actually are. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.